February 14th, 2024, Murphy's Tavern, Youngstown, Ohio. Mike Tyson sat alone at the end of the bar, nursing his third club soda, when 8 Hell's Angels walked through the door. The lead biker pointed directly at him. "Look what we got here, boys. Iron Mike himself." Tyson didn't look up, didn't flinch, just kept stirring the ice in his glass like he'd been doing for the past hour. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything anyone thought they knew about the former heavyweight champion. The police found 3 bikers unconscious, 2 more hospitalized, and the lead biker sitting across from Tyson crying like a child. But here's what the news never reported: why those bikers really came looking for him, and what Mike whispered to that young man that made a hardened criminal break down completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about violence is that it leaves a taste in your mouth. Metallic, sharp, like biting down on aluminum foil. Mike Tyson had been trying to forget that taste for 8 years, 3 months and 16 days. Now it was back. He flexed his right hand, knuckles already swelling from where they'd connected with the second biker's jaw. The sound had been wet, final, like breaking a wishbone, except wishes didn't bleed all over Murphy's sawdust floor. Jesus Christ, Mike. Danny Murphy emerged from behind the bar where he'd been crouched since the first punch flew. The tavern owner's hands shook as he reached for his phone. "I gotta call this in." "No!" Mike's voice cut through the groaning of the unconscious men scattered around overturned tables. "Not yet." He stared at the young man sitting across from him in the booth they'd somehow ended up in after the chaos. 24, maybe 25. Same broad shoulders Mike remembered seeing in mirrors 3 decades ago. Same dark eyes that had once stared back at him from magazine covers and pay-per-view promos. The kid, because that's all he was, despite the leather vest and the prospect patch, wiped snot and tears with the back of his tattooed hand. His colors were torn where Mike had grabbed him, lifting him clean off the ground before slamming him into the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. "Say it again." Mike's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of collapsed dreams and midnight regrets. "My name is Marcus D'Angelo." The young man's voice cracked. "My mother was Samantha D'Angelo. You knew her in '99, Atlantic City, the night before the Botha fight." Mike closed his eyes. The memories came flooding back like dirty water through a broken dam. The hotel suite, the party that went too long, the girl with the laugh that reminded him of wind chimes, how she'd disappeared before he woke up, leaving only a note with her name and a phone number he'd never called because his life had already been spiraling beyond control. "She died when I was 16, Marcus continued, his voice steadier now. "Cancer. But before she went, she told me who my father was. Showed me newspaper clippings, magazine articles, said you were the strongest man in the world." The irony tasted worse than the violence. "You joined up with these animals to find me?" Mike gestured at the groaning bikers. One of them, a heavy-set man with a gray beard, was trying to crawl toward the door, leaving a trail of blood from his broken nose. "I joined because I was angry, because I was stupid, because I thought if I could prove myself to them, prove I was tough enough, maybe I'd understand what made you who you were." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "They said we were coming here to shake down Murphy for protection money. Said there was some washed-up celebrity who might try to play hero. They didn't tell me it was you until we walked through that door." Mike studied his son's face, because that's what he was, wasn't it? His son. The word felt foreign, like speaking a language he'd never learned. He'd always known there might be children out there, consequences of a life lived without boundaries or conscience. But knowing something in your head and having it sit across from you, breathing and bleeding and real, were different universes entirely. "The protection money," Mike said. "That's not what this is really about." Marcus shook his head. "Captain Torres sends them around to collect from local businesses, keeps them in line, keeps his hands clean. He's been running this town like his personal kingdom for years." The mention of Torres made Mike's jaw tighten. Police Captain Rick Torres, who'd married Sarah Murphy 2 years ago. Sarah, who'd brought her 17-year-old daughter Emma into a house where bruises got explained away as accidents and teenage girls learned to flinch at the sound of heavy footsteps on stairs. Mike had been watching, waiting, planning something that would either save that girl or land him back in a cage for the rest of his life. "They know," Marcus said quietly, "about you and the girl. Torres knows you've been asking questions. That's why he sent us tonight, wanted to send a message." The taste in Mike's mouth got stronger. He looked around Murphy's Tavern, the place that had become his refuge, his church, his confessional, the place where he came every night to count another day sober and pretend he was becoming someone worth redemption. 8 years of rebuilding. 8 years of swallowing his rage and learning to breathe through the darkness that lived behind his ribs like a caged animal. All of it was about to crumble, because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it walks through the door wearing leather and calling you father. Outside, snow continued to fall on Youngstown like ash from a fire that would never go out. Mike stared at the amber liquid in his glass, watching the ice cubes melt into perfect spheres. Ginger ale. 8 years, 3 months, and 17 days since his last drink, but he still ordered it in a rocks glass out of habit. Some rituals died harder than others. The tavern had gone quiet except for the occasional groan from the bikers still sprawled across the floor. Danny Murphy moved between them with a wet towel, cleaning blood from his precious hardwood while muttering prayers in Irish. The man had inherited this place from his father, and his father before that. 3 generations of Murphys serving shots and listening to confessions in a town that specialized in broken dreams. "We need to move them," Danny said, not looking at Mike, "before someone calls it in." Mike nodded but didn't move. His right hand throbbed where the knuckles had split open, skin softer now than it used to be, conditioned by years of wrapping kids' hands instead of throwing punches. He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar ache of impact traveling up his forearm like an old friend knocking at the door. Across from him, Marcus held a bag of frozen peas against his swollen cheek. The boy, Mike couldn't think of him any other way yet, kept stealing glances like he was trying to memorize something he might never see again. There was a hunger in those dark eyes that Mike recognized, the same desperate need for approval that had driven him to chase heavyweight belts and magazine covers, thinking they could fill the empty spaces where a father's love should have lived. "Tell me about her," Mike said quietly. "Your mother." Marcus shifted in the booth, the vinyl squeaking under his weight. "She worked at a casino, blackjack dealer. Said you were different from the other fighters who came through. Quieter, like you were carrying something heavy." Mike remembered. Not clearly, those days were painted in broad strokes of cocaine and rage, but he remembered the feeling of being seen by someone who didn't want anything from him except a few hours of pretending to be normal. Samantha D'Angelo. Wind chimes and soft hands, and the kind of laugh that made you forget, temporarily, that you were destroying yourself one decision at a time. "She never asked for money," Marcus continued. "Never tried to contact you, said you had enough problems without adding us to the list." The words hit harder than any punch Mike had taken in the ring. He thought about all the women who'd tried to trap him, to claim pieces of his fame and fortune, and here was one who'd protected him from the truth, even when that truth might have saved her life. "Cancer, you said?" "Breast. Fought it for 2 years. I dropped out of school to take care of her." Marcus's voice cracked slightly. She kept apologizing, like being sick was her fault, like I had somewhere better to be. Mike's throat tightened. He understood that kind of guilt, the way it burrowed into your bones and made a nest there, laying eggs that hatched into self-hatred. "You did good by her, did I?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "Look where I ended up. Look what I became." Before Mike could respond, the tavern's back door opened with a squeal of hinges. Emma Murphy stepped through, shaking snow from her dark hair. 17 years old, with her mother's green eyes and a careful way of moving that spoke of someone who'd learned to navigate minefields. She froze when she saw the scene: overturned tables, groaning bikers, blood on the floor. Her gaze found Mike, and something passed between them, an understanding built over months of careful conversations, and the kind of trust that develops between people who recognize damage in each other. "Emma." Mike stood slowly, his back protesting. "You shouldn't be here. I saw the bikes outside." Her voice was steady, but Mike caught the tremor underneath. "Rick's working late tonight. Mom's at her sister's. I thought—" She trailed off, looking at Marcus. "Who's this?" Mike felt the weight of truth settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. How do you explain that the past has teeth? That sometimes the things you thought you'd buried claw their way to the surface and demand reckoning? "Someone I used to know," he said finally. Emma's eyes narrowed. She was smart, this kid. Smart enough to know when adults were feeding her half-truths. Smart enough to survive 2 years with Rick Torres without completely breaking. The bikes belong to Torres's crew. I've seen them at the house. The confirmation hit Mike like cold water. Everything Marcus had said about Torres, about the protection racket, about targeting Murphys, it wasn't just about money. It was personal. Torres knew Mike had been asking questions about Emma's bruises, about the way she flinched when men raised their voices. "You need to go home," Mike said. "No." Emma's chin lifted with stubborn defiance. "I'm tired of going home. I'm tired of pretending everything's fine when it's not." Outside, the snow kept falling, and Mike could feel the weight of decisions pressing down like winter itself. The boy across from him carried his blood. The girl in front of him carried his protection, and somewhere in this Rust Belt town, a corrupt cop was planning his next move. 8 years of sobriety, 8 years of rebuilding. All of it balanced on the edge of a knife. Mike's phone buzzed against the table like an angry hornet. He glanced at the screen, unknown number, and felt his stomach drop. In 8 years of carefully controlled sobriety, unknown numbers at midnight had never brought good news. "Answer it," Emma said, her voice tight with the kind of intuition that comes from living with predators. "Something's wrong." Mike swiped the screen. "Yeah, Iron Mike fucking Tyson." The voice was gravelly, amused, and completely unfamiliar. The legend himself, "Though you look a little rough around the edges these days." "Who is this?" "Name's Diesel. I run the Youngstown charter of the Hells Angels, and you just put 4 of my boys in the hospital." Mike's blood turned to ice water. He looked at the groaning bikers on Murphy's floor. Still breathing, still moving. "They're not in any hospital." A low chuckle crackled through the speaker. "Not those clowns. I'm talking about the real crew, the ones who were supposed to back them up if things went sideways. Funny thing happened on their way to Murphy's. They got jumped in the parking lot of your little gym. Professional job. Quick, clean, efficient." The room tilted. Mike gripped the phone harder, his knuckles white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Course you don't. But here's what I know. Those boys were found beaten unconscious next to your Oldsmobile. And there was a note pinned to one of their cuts. Want to guess what it said?" Mike's mouth went dry. Across the table, Marcus was staring at him with growing alarm. Emma had gone pale, her green eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from recognizing the sound of walls closing in. It said, "Stay away from Iron Mike's family." Written in your handwriting, champ. Least that's what it looks like to me. "That's impossible." But even as Mike said it, he felt the trap closing around him like a steel bear trap. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone who knew about Marcus, about Emma, about the delicate balance he'd been trying to maintain. "Is it? See, I got a call about an hour ago from a mutual friend. Captain Torres. Real stand-up guy. He tells me you've been making threats. Says you've been stalking his stepdaughter, talking about how you're gonna hurt him. Says maybe it's time someone taught you some respect." The pieces clicked into place like bullets sliding into a chamber. Torres hadn't just sent the bikers to intimidate Mike, he'd set up an elaborate frame job. The attack on the backup crew, the forged note, the phone call. All of it designed to make Mike look guilty of something he hadn't done while giving Torres legal cover for whatever came next. "You're being played," Mike said, his voice steady despite the chaos building in his chest. "Torres is using you. Maybe. Or maybe you're exactly what he says you are, a washed-up psychopath who can't let go of his glory days. Either way, we got a problem now. My boys are in the hospital, and that means we gotta have a conversation about consequences." Marcus stood up suddenly, his face white. "Diesel," he whispered. "That's my sponsor. The guy who brought me into the club." Emma grabbed Mike's free arm. "He knows," she hissed. "Rick knows about tonight, about us talking. He's been planning this." Mike felt the familiar darkness uncurling in his chest like smoke from a long-dead fire. 8 years of meditation, therapy, and counting days had taught him to recognize the warning signs. The way his vision narrowed, the way his breathing changed, the way violence started to feel like the only reasonable solution to an unreasonable world. "Here's how this plays out," Diesel continued through the phone. "You got 24 hours to make this right. Bring me the money. Let's call it 50 grand for medical expenses and emotional trauma. And you're gonna personally apologize to every one of my boys. And if I don't, then we stop playing games. See, I know all about your little rehabilitation story, how you found Jesus and sobriety and all that beautiful bullshit. But I also know what you really are underneath all that self-help garbage. You're a killer, Mike. Always have been. And killers don't retire, they just get rusty." The line went dead. Mike stared at the phone for a long moment, feeling the weight of inevitability settling over him like a shroud. He'd spent 8 years building a life based on control, on choosing peace over violence, on believing that people could change if they worked hard enough at it. But some traps don't care about your personal growth. Some enemies don't give you the luxury of walking away. And sometimes the past doesn't just return, it kicks down your door and burns your new life to the ground. Marcus was looking at him with something that might have been hope or terror. Emma was still gripping his arm like she could anchor him to his better angels through sheer will. Outside, the snow kept falling on Youngstown like ash from a future that was already burning. The equilibrium was broken. There was no going back now. Mike set the phone down like it might explode. The silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating, loaded with the weight of 24 hours that suddenly felt like 24 minutes. He could feel Emma and Marcus watching him, waiting for him to say something that would make sense of the nightmare that had just crawled through the phone lines. "We should run," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of us. Just get in your car and drive until we hit Canada." Mike almost laughed. Almost. The idea of Iron Mike Tyson running from anything would have been comedy gold for the tabloids that used to follow his every stumble. But sitting in Murphy's Tavern with blood on his knuckles and his son's eyes boring into him like accusation itself, running felt less like cowardice and more like the first smart thing he'd considered all night. "Can't run from this," he said, flexing his damaged hand. "Torres has too many connections, too many people on his payroll. We'd make it maybe 50 miles before every cop in Ohio got our plates." Marcus shifted in his seat, the leather of his torn vest creaking. "Diesel doesn't make empty threats. When he says 24 hours, he means it. And 50 grand, he shook his head. "You might as well ask for the moon." "I've got maybe 8,000 in savings," Mike said, running numbers in his head that didn't add up to survival. "The gym barely breaks even. Everything else went to legal fees and rehab." The words tasted like ash. 8 years of careful financial planning, of living small and humble, and he was still one crisis away from ruin. Danny Murphy had finished cleaning blood from his floor and now stood behind the bar, polishing glasses with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The man hadn't said a word since the phone call, but Mike could read the terror in his movements. Murphy's Tavern had been in his family for 3 generations, and now it was going to become ground zero for a war he never asked for. "Danny," Mike called softly, "you should close up. Take a vacation. Visit your sister in Pittsburgh." "This is my place." Murphy's voice cracked like old leather. "My father built this bar with his own hands. I'm not running because some costumed thugs want to play gangster." But Mike could see it in his eyes, the knowledge that bravery and stubbornness weren't the same thing, that sometimes principles were luxuries honest men couldn't afford. Emma stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out onto Market Street. Snow continued to fall in fat, lazy flakes that caught the amber light from the street lamps. "There has to be something," she said, her breath fogging the glass. "Some way to prove Torres set this up. The timing's too perfect. The forged note, the setup at your gym." "Doesn't matter," Mike cut her off. "Even if we could prove it, who's going to believe us over a police captain? Torres has been building his reputation in this town for 15 years. I'm just a washed-up fighter with a criminal record." The truth of it settled over them like a burial shroud. In Youngstown, reputation was currency, and Mike's account had been overdrawn for decades. The local newspapers still ran stories about his comeback attempts, his charity work with kids, his quiet life of redemption. But underneath every article was the same subtext: once a monster, always a monster. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolled through contacts with shaking fingers. I could try talking to some of the other guys in the club. Not everyone likes Diesel. Maybe I could. No. Mike's voice carried the authority of absolute certainty. You're done with them. Tonight, you walk away and don't look back. It's not that simple. You don't just quit the Angels. There are rules, protocols. There are always rules, Mike said, thinking of every system that had tried to contain him over the years. Boxing commissions, parole officers, rehabilitation counselors. Question is whether you're going to live by their rules or your own. Outside, a police cruiser rolled slowly past Murphy's window, its searchlight sweeping across the snow-covered sidewalk. All three of them froze, watching the light probe the shadows like a predator sniffing for prey. The car didn't stop, but the message was clear. Torres was watching, waiting. When the cruiser disappeared around the corner, Emma turned from the window. Her young face carried an expression Mike had seen too many times in his own mirror, the look of someone realizing that the adults who were supposed to protect them were either corrupt or powerless. "So what do we do?" she asked. Mike stared at his reflection in his ginger ale, seeing a man caught between versions of himself. The monster he used to be, the saint he'd tried to become, and something else entirely, something that might have to emerge if any of them were going to survive the next 20 to 4 hours. The answer sat in his chest like a tumor, growing larger with each breath. But he wasn't ready to speak it aloud. Not yet.